Delegation today made something very clear, that they share President Trump's vision for peace.
That was National Security Advisor Mike Waltz speaking after talks wrapped up with the Ukrainians in Saudi Arabia. The Trump administration now says, of course, you just heard it, that Ukraine wants peace. For weeks, they said just the opposite. Editor-in-Chief of Foreign Policy, Ravi Agrawal, joins me now. He's a friend of this program, and I'm happy that's true. Ravi, are you surprised at the developments today with this announced ceasefire, and what do you think it tells us now about whatever distance there was before with the Trump White House and Ukrainian President Zelensky?
I'm not entirely surprised. I see it as a good sign that talks are taking place. Ultimately, everyone wants peace, or at least most people do, and this is a step in the right direction. There is a problem, however. The assumption on the American side, this American side, under the Trump administration, is that the Russians will act in good faith. And the problem is that there's a real difference in perceptions about trust. President Trump has made very clear that he trusts Putin, Russia's Putin. So in other words, were they to make a deal, he seems to think that Putin would stand by a deal and that security guarantees would not be necessary because he trusts Putin. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, have every reason to not trust the Russians, and so they would insist on security guarantees and a future that would, for them, make sure that the Russians wouldn't be aggressive again. There's another wrinkle here. The Europeans who've been meeting in Paris amid all of this also do not trust the United States any longer. So any guarantees that the United States would broker, the Europeans will rightly ask, well, what good is your word when you've quite openly been questioning the value of NATO and saying you might pull out? So even though it is a good step that all of these talks are taking place, there's a real mismatch in terms of trust. Different sides don't trust each other, and it comes down to that one question again and again: security guarantees. Who will put up the forces needed to ensure that Ukraine's future is secure?
Ravi, two questions. How meaningful is it to you that the president's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, is going to go to Moscow to talk possibly with Putin, or certainly those in his inner circle, about all this? Question one. Question two, what if the Russians don't abide by this, continue to bomb, shoot missiles into Ukraine? What options left are available to the Trump White House?
Yeah, these are great questions. And this is why it is so devilishly difficult to end a war that has now been going on for 3 years. So it is a good sign that Witkoff is going to Moscow and will speak to the Russians and present, everything that was agreed in Jeddah, and ask if the Russians similarly want to make a display that they want peace, just as the Ukrainians just have. But what does that mean? What does it entail? How is Russia going to guarantee that it's not going to go back on its word? And what actual forces will the West put up to ensure that is the case? So that remains the devilish question that no one really has any answers to unless you are willing to put up, And then to your other question, all of this is headed in a very strange direction because, again, it brings us back to square one. Unless all sides agree that any deal that is agreed upon is enforceable and that you can't act with impunity afterwards, so much trust is now broken down on all sides. It's very difficult to see how you come back from there. That is going to be Ukraine's challenge, to keep putting forward an idea for security guarantees. The Europeans are key here, but the problem there is that everything they are doing right now to try and build up their defense capabilities, their industrial base that supplies their defense capabilities, that takes years to come to fruition. So even though they're saying all the right things, action will take a while. And it really begs the question, what were they doing all this time?
Ravi, before I let you go, one last question. In terms of words, deeds, and optics, does this ceasefire agreement need to be negotiated face-to-face between Trump and Putin and then announced with them jointly signing something to give the Ukrainians and to your other point, the Europeans, a sense that this might actually be binding?
I think there's that, but ultimately, the paper an agreement is written on is only worth the paper. Ultimately, I think the Ukrainians will look for boots on the ground, their own boots on the ground, some European boots on the ground, and then maybe some acknowledgement that or some guarantee that the United States will back them up in the event of renewed Russian aggression. Without that, you're back to square one. No agreement is worth anything if you don't have security guarantees. And the Ukrainians are going to keep making that point, no matter how much they are pressed to display and say that they want peace. Of course they want peace, but at what cost?
Ravi Agrawal, Foreign Policy. Thank you, sir, as always.